On the morning of her birthday, Alara Hughes chose silence over celebration. She boarded a train alone, carrying a small suitcase and a heavier truth. She was tired of living for expectations that never fit her. Turning 30 felt less like a milestone and more like a question mark, one she hoped the sea might help her answer. The coastal town she'd chosen on impulse unfolded gently around her, narrow stone streets, gulls crying overhead, the scent of salt and rain woven into the air. No one knew her here, and that anonymity felt like freedom. She checked into a modest cottage overlooking the cliffs, left her phone untouched, and wandered until dusk led her into a small cafe glowing with warm light. It was there, in that unplanned moment, that everything shifted. Behind the counter stood a woman with calm, observant eyes and an easy smile that seemed to pause time. When their gazes met, Alara felt a soft jolt, unexpected, electric, unsettling in the best way. The woman noticed the single candle beside Alara's tea and wished her a happy birthday, her voice gentle, almost intimate, as if the words were meant only for her. They exchanged a few simple sentences, nothing extraordinary, yet Alara walked out with her heart beating faster than it had all day. Outside, the wind tugged at her coat, but inside she felt strangely warm, like something long dormant had stirred awake. Alone again in the cottage, listening to the waves crash below the cliffs, Alara realized that this trip, meant to be an escape, already felt like the beginning of something else. She didn't know the woman's name, didn't know why the brief encounter lingered in her thoughts, but for the first time in years, her birthday felt meaningful. As she fell asleep to the sound of the sea, Alara smiled softly, unaware that destiny had already taken notice of her quiet choice to be brave. The next afternoon, Alara found herself returning to the cafe without fully understanding why. She told herself it was for the view, for the comfort of warm tea against the chill outside, but the moment she stepped in and saw the same woman behind the counter, her heart betrayed the truth. The woman smiled as if she'd been expecting her, a small, knowing curve of her lips that made Alara's pulse quicken. Her name, Alara learned, was Rowan. A name that fit her effortlessly, like it had always belonged to the sea and the quiet town. Rowan spoke with an ease that felt disarming, asking about Alara's trip, her birthday, her reasons for traveling alone. There was no pressure in her questions, only curiosity, and Alara found herself answering more honestly than she usually did, admitting she'd needed space, a pause from a life that felt too loud and too planned. Rowan listened closely, leaning against the counter, eyes never drifting away, as though Alara's words mattered more than the clatter of cups around them. She shared pieces of herself too, how she'd once lived in the city, how she'd chosen this town for its slowness, how staying had felt like finally breathing properly. Something unspoken grew between them, woven through lingering glances and the way Rowan's fingers brushed Alara's hand when she passed over a cup. The touch was brief, accidental, yet it sent a quiet thrill through Alara, warming her from the inside out. When Alara finally stood to leave, reluctant in a way that surprised her, Rowan hesitated, then slid a small piece of paper across the counter. Written in soft, careful handwriting were a few simple words and a time, an invitation disguised as a suggestion. Alara folded the note into her pocket, her smile lingering long after she stepped back into the cool afternoon air. As she walked toward the cliffs, the sea stretching endlessly beside her, she realized she wasn't just looking forward to the rest of her trip anymore. She was waiting with a flutter. Mix of nerves and hope, to see Rowan again. As the sun began its slow descent, Alara followed the narrow path along the cliffs, the folded note warm in her pocket as if it carried its own quiet heat. The sky softened into shades of gold and rose, the sea below reflecting the colors like a secret it had been waiting to reveal. Rowan was already there when Alara arrived, standing near the edge with her hands tucked into her jacket, hair loose and dancing in the wind. She turned at the sound of footsteps, her smile unguarded, almost relieved, and in that moment Alara knew she'd wanted to be here more than she'd admitted to herself. They walked together in easy silence, close enough for their shoulders to brush, the air between them alive with words that didn't need to be spoken. When they stopped, the world seemed to narrow to just the two of them and the endless horizon. Rowan spoke first, her voice softer now, confessing that she hadn't expected Alara to come, that something about her had lingered long after she'd left the cafe. Alara felt her breath catch, honesty rising to meet the moment, and she admitted she'd felt it too, the pull, the strange sense of recognition. The wind grew stronger, carrying the scent of salt and rain, and Rowan reached out, tucking a loose strand of Alara's hair behind her ear, her fingers lingering just a second too long. The touch sent a shiver through Alara, grounding and exhilarating all at once. Without fully deciding to, she stepped closer, her heart pounding as she searched Rowan's face for permission. Rowan didn't step back. Their kiss came slowly, tentative and tender, lips meeting as if testing the reality of the moment. It was soft, unhurried, filled with warmth rather than urgency, and when they parted, both of them smiled like they'd crossed an invisible line together. The sea roared below them, the sky darkening inch by inch, but Alara felt lighter than she had in years. For the first time since boarding that train alone, she understood that this trip wasn't just about escape, it was about opening herself to something unexpectedly real. After that evening on the cliffs, Alara began to measure her days by moments that led her back to Rowan. She returned to the cafe the next morning, then the next, each visit feeling less like coincidence and more like choice. Rowan greeted her with the same quiet warmth, though now there was something new beneath it. A shared memory that lived in their glances and softened every word they exchanged. They talked about small things at first, safe things, yet even those conversations carried an intimacy that made Alara's chest feel full. As the days passed, the cafe closed later than usual, the chairs left unstacked while the town outside grew still. Rowan would play soft music from her phone, the notes filling the space between them, and Alara would sit on the counter, watching the way Rowan moved with practiced ease, feeling a calm she hadn't known she'd been craving. Sometimes Rowan brushed a bit of flour from Alara's cheek, her fingers warm and familiar now, and sometimes Alara traced idle circles on Rowan's wrist while they talked, both of them pretending the touches were absent-minded when they clearly were not. One evening, rain began tapping insistently against the windows, trapping Alara inside just as she'd been preparing to leave. Rowan locked the door with a gentle click that echoed louder than it should have, and for a moment they simply stood there, the cafe dim and quiet, the world narrowed to the sound of rain and breathing. Rowan stepped closer, her hand finding Alara's waist as if it belonged there, and Alara leaned in without hesitation. Their kiss was deeper this time, slower, layered with recognition and trust, and Alara felt herself melt into it, her fingers curling into Rowan's shirt. When they finally pulled apart, foreheads resting together, Alara realized she was smiling without meaning to. She didn't know where this would lead, didn't know how long her courage would last, but she knew this, being here with Rowan, felt effortless and true. And for the first time in a long while, staying late felt exactly like where she was meant to be. That night, Rowan walked Alara back to her cottage, the rain easing into a fine mist that clung to the air and softened the glow of the street lamps. They moved slowly, unhurried, their hands brushing often enough that it no longer felt accidental. At the door, Alara hesitated, keys cool in her palm, suddenly aware of how quiet everything was, how close Rowan stood. The moment stretched, fragile and full, until Rowan met her eyes and asked softly if she could come in. Alara nodded, the answer already written in the way her heart leapt. Inside, the cottage was dim and warm, lit only by a small lamp and the distant sound of waves crashing against the cliffs. Rowan set her jacket aside, glancing around with a faint smile, and when she turned back, Alara closed the distance between them. Their kiss was unspoken but certain, deeper than before, layered with trust and a growing sense of belonging. Rowan's hands were gentle as they traced Alara's back, her touch reverent rather than rushed, as if she were learning something precious. Elara responded instinctively, fingers curling at Rowan's shoulders, pulling her closer, breathing her in. They moved together without urgency, letting the night unfold at its own pace, sharing soft laughter and whispered confessions between kisses. When they finally settled onto the sofa, wrapped in a blanket, Rowan rested her forehead against Elara's, their breaths mingling in the quiet. Elara felt a profound sense of safety, of being seen without needing to explain herself, and it surprised her how deeply that feeling settled in her chest. They spoke in low voices about small memories and unfulfilled dreams, their words weaving another kind of intimacy between them. Later, when sleep crept in gently, Rowan's arm remained around Elara, steady and warm, and Elara drifted off with a soft smile, the sea humming outside as if in approval. She knew this night would stay with her long after the trip ended, but for now, wrapped in shared warmth and quiet affection, she allowed herself to simply be. Morning arrived quietly, light slipping through the curtains and settling gently across the room. Elara woke first, disoriented for a moment before awareness returned. Rowan beside her, breathing slow and even, her arms still loosely draped as if it had always belonged there. The intimacy of it made Elara's chest tighten, not with fear, but with something more complicated. Reality, patient and unavoidable, began to press in. This trip had an end date. Her life elsewhere waited, unchanged and demanding. She shifted carefully, not wanting to wake Rowan yet, and sat up, wrapping the blanket around herself as she stared toward the window where the sea shimmered in pale morning light. The joy of the night before now carried an edge of uncertainty, a question she wasn't ready to answer. When Rowan stirred and opened her eyes, her smile was immediate and unguarded, but it softened when she noticed the distance in Elara's posture. Rowan didn't push. She simply reached for Elara's hand, thumb brushing her knuckles in a grounding, familiar way. Elara confessed her fear in pieces, how she'd come here to escape, how falling for someone hadn't been part of the plan, how leaving suddenly felt unbearable. Rowan listened without interrupting, her expression steady, eyes kind, and when Elara finally fell silent, Rowan spoke with gentle honesty. She admitted she was afraid too, not of Elara, but of holding on to something that might slip away. There was no drama in her words, only truth, and that made them heavier. They shared a quiet breakfast, moving around each other carefully, as if afraid a wrong step might shatter the fragile peace. When Rowan finally left, promising to see Elara later, the door closing felt louder than it should have. Alone again, Elara stood in the stillness of the cottage, torn between the safety of returning to what she knew and the terrifying pull of what she'd just begun to feel. For the first time in years, choosing felt difficult, not because she was lost, but because she had found something worth staying for. The sky darkened faster than expected that evening, clouds rolling in thick and restless, mirroring the unease Elara carried with her all day. She tried to distract herself, packing, unpacking, staring out at the sea, but every thought circled back to Rowan and the unfinished weight of their conversation. When the rain began, sudden and relentless, it felt like a decision being made without her consent. Elara grabbed her coat and ran, letting the storm soak her hair and clothes as she followed the familiar path to the cafe. Light spilled from the windows, a beacon cutting through the gray, and when she pushed the door open, breathless and drenched, Rowan looked up in startled relief. They stared at each other for a heartbeat, everything unsaid hanging thick in the air, before Elara crossed the room and kissed her. It was urgent but not desperate, filled with the kind of honesty that only came from fear of loss. Rowan kissed her back just as fiercely, hands framing Elara's face, grounding her in the moment. Rain thundered against the windows, the world outside dissolving into sound and shadow, while inside they held on to each other as if anchoring themselves. When they finally pulled apart, foreheads pressed together, Elara spoke through unsteady breaths, admitting she didn't want this to become just a fleeting memory she'd carry alone. Rowan's reply was immediate and certain. She didn't want that either, and she wasn't afraid of the unknown if Alara was willing to meet her there. The storm raged on, but something between them settled, quieter and stronger than before. Alara felt the tension in her chest ease, replaced by a steady warmth that spread slowly, reassuring rather than overwhelming. For the first time since the fear had crept in that morning, she wasn't running from the choice ahead. She was standing in it, rain-soaked and open, realizing that sometimes the bravest thing wasn't leaving, it was turning back and claiming what mattered. The storm passed, leaving the town washed clean and strangely quiet, as if it too were catching its breath. Alara stayed longer than she had planned that night, helping Rowan close the cafe, their movements falling into an easy rhythm that felt natural now. The fear that had hovered between them earlier softened into something gentler, replaced by conversations that reached deeper than before. They talked about past relationships, about moments when they'd chosen safety over honesty, about the courage it took to begin again. Rowan admitted she'd built a life in Whitby Hollow because it felt steady, but steady had sometimes meant lonely. Alara confessed that she'd spent years saying yes to everything except herself. In the quiet after midnight, they walked back toward the cliffs, the air cool and fresh, hands intertwined without hesitation. They stopped to watch the moon reflect across the calm sea, and Alara leaned into Rowan, resting her head against her shoulder. The simplicity of the gesture felt profound. Over the following days, one night turned into many. Alara delayed her departure without making announcements, letting the choice unfold naturally instead of forcing it. Mornings were spent sharing coffee and laughter, afternoons wandering the town, evenings returning to the cafe where Rowan would catch Alara watching her and smile like she already knew. Love didn't arrive loudly. It settled in quietly, in shared routines and unspoken understanding. Alara realized she wasn't counting days anymore. She was living inside them. The uncertainty hadn't disappeared. The following morning arrived with soft sunlight spilling over the cliffs, illuminating the quiet town in gold. Alara sat by the window of her cottage, watching the waves curl and break below, the note of Rowan's laughter from the cafe still lingering in her mind. Today felt heavier somehow, the inevitability of leaving pressing down despite the comfort she had found. She dressed slowly, her hands brushing over the clothes she would soon pack, each item a small reminder that her time here was limited. But the thought of saying goodbye to Rowan, even for a short while, felt impossible. She needed to see her one more time, to feel the warmth of her presence before making any decision. Stepping into the drizzle, she hurried toward the cafe, the damp air mingling with the salt from the sea. Rowan was there, straightening the counter, her gaze lifting immediately when she spotted Alara. No words were needed. The silent understanding between them was palpable. Alara crossed the space between them, heart hammering, and took Rowan's hand, holding it tightly. "I don't want this to end," she whispered, voice trembling. Rowan's thumb brushed her knuckles, reassuring, steady. "Then don't let it," she replied softly. They embraced in the quiet morning, the drizzle soaking their coats, oblivious to everything except each other. Alara felt the tension that had shadowed her since the trip began dissolve, replaced by a grounding certainty. For the first time, leaving didn't feel like the only choice. Staying, being with Rowan, was possible, and suddenly, everything else seemed less urgent. In that embrace, with the waves roaring below and the wind tangling their hair, Alara realized she had already chosen, without needing to speak it aloud. She was not leaving, not yet, not when this feeling, this connection, was still alive and real. By the time Alara made her decision, the town had taken on a kind of quiet magic, the streets washed clean from the last rain, the sea reflecting the soft glow of the late afternoon sun. She stood outside the cafe, keys in hand, heart racing as Rowan approached, her eyes immediately finding Alara's. There was a pause, a fragile moment of anticipation, before Alara finally spoke. "I'm not ready to leave," she said, voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. Rowan's face softened, a smile spreading that seemed to reach into every corner of Alara's heart. Without a word, she closed the distance between them, and their kiss was gentle at first, questioning, then deepened with certainty, sealing the unspoken agreement between them. Alara felt a rush of relief and joy, as if all the hesitation and fear of the past weeks had been lifted in a single, perfect moment. Hand in hand, they walked along the cliffs, the wind tangling their hair, the waves roaring below like applause. Alara knew the choice she had made was not easy, but it was hers, and it was real. For the first time in years, she felt fully alive, fully herself, and fully seen. They paused at the edge of the cliffs, the world stretching wide and endless before them, and Rowan tucked a loose strand of hair behind Alara's ear, her touch soft and intimate. "Best solo trip I ever took," Alara whispered, her smile radiant. Rowan laughed softly, leaning in for another tender kiss. "Destiny has good timing," she replied. And in that moment, with the sun dipping into the horizon and the sea singing below, Alara understood that this trip had been about more than escape. It had been about finding the woman who would change her life, and in doing so, discovering a love she had always deserved. Months passed, and what had begun as a chance encounter blossomed into a love that felt steady, real, and unshakable. Alara no longer measured her days by trips or departures. She measured them by Rowan's smile, the warmth of her hand in hers, the quiet intimacy of shared routines. They spent mornings together in the cafe, afternoons wandering the cliffs and town, evenings wrapped in blankets on the sofa, talking about dreams, fears, and everything in between. Each day reinforced what Alara had already known. This was not fleeting, and it was not a mistake. Birthdays lost their weight of expectation, replaced by the simple joy of being present together. Rowan introduced Alara to the rhythms of Whitby Hollow. From seasons shifted, and with each passing month, Alara and Rowan's bond grew stronger, deepening in ways that felt both natural and exhilarating. The town of Whitby Hollow, once a quiet backdrop for Alara's solo escape, became the canvas for their shared life. Sunlit mornings in the cafe, strolls along windswept cliffs, and evenings spent curled up together as the waves crashed below. Every laugh, every touch, every lingering kiss wove them closer, creating a rhythm that neither had anticipated, but both embraced wholeheartedly. Alara often found herself watching Rowan across the room, heart swelling at the ease with which she moved through life, at the kindness she carried in her gaze, at the way her presence could quiet all the restless noise in Alara's mind. Rowan, in turn, seemed to find something in Alara that mirrored her own quiet longing, a courage, a vulnerability, a willingness to be fully seen. They celebrated small victories together, comforted each other in disappointments, and navigated the uncertainties of life with a shared determination that made even mundane moments feel extraordinary. Their love wasn't a blaze of sudden passion, but a steady, glowing warmth that persisted through ordinary days and quiet nights, a testament to the power of connection and choice. One evening, as they watched the sun melt into the horizon from their favorite cliffside spot, Rowan turned to Alara, fingers entwined, and whispered, "I never believed in destiny until I met you." Alara smiled, resting her head against Rowan's shoulder, feeling the truth of the words in the steady beat of her heart. "Neither did I," she admitted softly. "But now I do." In that shared silence, with the world stretching endlessly before them, Alara understood that her solo birthday trip had not been an ending or an escape. It had been the beginning of a life she had always hoped for, a life shaped by love, courage, and the woman who had changed everything.